The silence of the Vatican Apostolic Archive is a substance unto itself. It is not merely an absence of sound, but a palpable presence, thick and heavy, accumulated over centuries. It settles on the towering shelves of ancient vellum and parchment. It sleeps in the brittle pages of letters, written by kings and popes, and it watches from the dim high vaults, where golden light falls in slanting columns from windows set deep in the stone. This is a silence that has absorbed the whispers of history, the scratch of quills on papal decrees, the soft footfalls of scholars and clerics, who have passed through these halls, guardians of the most formidable collection of secrets the world has ever known. To walk here is to feel the weight of millennia. The air smells of aged paper, of dry leather, of a faint, sacred dust. Every document, every codex, every sealed scroll is a thread in the vast and intricate tapestry of Western civilization. Some threads are bright with glory and divine inspiration, while others are dark, stained by controversy, power, and blood. It is said that no single person, not even the Pope himself, knows the full contents of this labyrinthine repository. Its secrets are compartmentalized, protected by layers of tradition, oath, and formidable stone walls. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a slow, dawning realization, a puzzle whose pieces were scattered across continents and centuries, waiting for a particular mind to begin assembling them. It is a story that challenges the very foundations of faith and history. A story the Church, for the better part of 2,000 years, has endeavored to keep hidden. This is not the story of a lost gospel or a forgotten relic. It is far more profound, far more dangerous. It is the story of a fundamental divergence, a deliberate turning away from a path not taken, and truth so unsettling that its revelation could unravel the tapestry itself. The central figure in the initial discovery was a man named Father Leo Brennan, an Irish-American priest and historian of rare brilliance and unshakable faith. In the early 1950s, Father Brennan was granted unprecedented access to the archive's restricted sections, tasked with the seemingly mundane project to compile a definitive chronology of early church administrative edicts from the first 3 centuries after Christ. He was chosen for his meticulous nature, his mastery of ancient languages, and his impeccable orthodoxy. He was, in every sense, a trusted insider. For months, Father Brennan worked in peaceful solitude, surrounded by the ghosts of history. His days were a rhythm of careful unrolling of scrolls, deciphering faded Latin and Greek, and taking precise notes. He moved through the expected texts, the letters of Clement, the fragments of Ignatius of Antioch, the official proclamations of early popes. The work was proceeding exactly as planned. But history has a way of interrupting the best-laid plans. It began with a discrepancy, so minor it would have been invisible to a less attentive eye. While cross-referencing a letter from a minor bishop in Anatolia with the official records of the Council of Nicaea, Father Brennan noticed a subtle inconsistency in the phrasing of a doctrinal point. The difference was a matter of a single Greek word, a preposition that could be translated as through instead of from. It was the kind of scholarly nuance that filled academic papers but rarely shook the world. Yet, it nagged at him. It was like hearing a single instrument playing slightly out of tune in a grand symphony. Driven by a scholar's instinct, he began to dig deeper. He requested scrolls from a specific period and region, documents that were rarely examined, their contents considered settled history. As he pieced together letters from bishops, reports from missionaries, and even fragments of personal diaries from early Christians, a pattern began to emerge. It was not a pattern of unity and consensus, as the official history taught, but one of fierce, sometimes violent, disagreement over a fundamental question. The question was not about the nature of Christ or the authority of the Pope. Those debates would come later. This was something more primal, more essential to the very message of Jesus of Nazareth. The official narrative, the one enshrined in the Gospels and the Creeds, presented a spiritual kingdom, a call to personal salvation and preparation for the world to come. But the fragments Father Brennan was assembling pointed to a different emphasis, one that was dangerously tangible and immediate. They spoke of a message deeply intertwined with the material world, with a specific understanding of the natural order that bordered on what later centuries would call science. It was a tradition that viewed the miracles of Jesus not as suspensions of natural law to prove divinity, but as demonstrations of a deeper, accessible law inherent in creation itself, a law that humanity in its fallen state had forgotten. This was not the Gnosticism the Church had condemned. with its denial of the material world as evil. This was something else entirely. It was an affirmation of the world as a sacred text, filled with divine patterns and energies that could be perceived and harnessed by those with purified hearts and enlightened minds. It suggested that Jesus came not only to save souls from sin, but to awaken humanity to a latent potential, to restore a lost knowledge of how to interact with the fabric of reality. Father Brennan felt a cold dread seep into him, a sensation entirely separate from the archive's natural chill. He understood the implication. If this interpretation had survived, if it had become the dominant strand of Christianity, the history of the West would have been unrecognizable. Faith and reason, science and religion, might never have become bitter adversaries. The Church's authority, however, would have been radically different. Its power would not have been based solely on its role as the sole mediator of divine grace through the sacraments, but also as a guide to a more direct, experiential knowledge of God through His creation. He realized, with a heart pounding against his priestly robes, that he was not looking at a heretical side note. The evidence suggested that this knowledge tradition, as he began to call it, was not a fringe belief. In the first century, it may have been the mainstream. It was there, subtly, in the parables about the mustard seed and the leaven, in the concept of the kingdom of God within you. It was a message that empowered the individual in a way that was deeply threatening to any centralized religious authority. And then, he found the key. It was a fragmented copy of a letter, attributed to a figure on the fringes of the New Testament, that spoke in coded but clear terms of the turning of the key and the sealing of the spring. It described a conscious decision, taken by a powerful faction within the early church in the late 1st or early 2nd century, to suppress this knowledge tradition. The reason was starkly pragmatic. It was too dangerous. It was too easily misunderstood, too susceptible to individualistic interpretation, too likely to lead to chaos and schism. In the fragile, persecuted early church, unity was survival. A simple, clear, and centrally controlled message was deemed necessary for the church to endure and conquer the Roman Empire. The complexities of the knowledge tradition were a luxury it could not afford. It was, the fragment chillingly concluded, the most dangerous secret, for if known, would prevent the church from ever becoming the rock upon which the world rests. Father Brennan sat back, the fragile piece of parchment trembling in his hand. The silence of the archive was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory, complicit. He understood now that he had stumbled upon the raison d'etre of the Vatican's secret. This was not a cover-up of a crime or a scandal. It was something far grander and more terrifying. It was the foundational act of the institution itself, the deliberate choice to build its eternal empire upon a simplified version of the truth, burying a more potent and dangerous one deep within its vaults, hoping that the weight of centuries would crush it into dust. He knew he could never speak of this. To do so would not just be heresy. It would be an act of existential sabotage against the very institution that was his life. And so, he closed the scrolls, returned the fragments to their boxes, and wrote his official report on early church administration, making no mention of the terrifying pattern he had uncovered. But he could not unsee it. The secret was now alive within him, a silent, burning ember in the heart of the Vatican's deepest silence. And embers, given the right conditions, have a way of catching fire. Father Leo Brennan left the archive that day, and every day thereafter, a changed man. The world outside, the bustling piazzas of Rome, the sun-drenched stone of the basilica, even the familiar rituals of the Mass, all seemed to exist behind a thin veil. He moved through his duties with automatic precision, his mind a whirlwind of Greek phrases, historical implications, and a profound, disorienting spiritual vertigo. The faith that had been his anchor, a solid, unshakable rock, now felt more like a magnificent, ancient ship built upon a hidden flaw in its keel. It was seaworthy. It had sailed through millennia of storms, but he alone knew of the fragility hidden deep within its structure. He tried to rationalize what he had found. Perhaps he had misinterpreted the texts. Maybe the knowledge tradition was indeed a Gnostic heresy he was failing to distinguish correctly. He was a historian, not a theologian of that caliber. He threw himself into prayer, seeking guidance, a sign that he was wrong. But the silence from heaven felt different now. It felt like the silence of the archivar, silence that kept secrets. Weeks turned into months. The ember of his discovery refused to be extinguished. It glowed in the darkness of his prayers. It sparked when he read the scriptures, casting new and unsettling light on familiar passages. The parable of the talents, for instance, was always taught as a lesson about using one's God-given gifts. But now he wondered, what if the talent was not just a metaphor for personal ability, but a symbol of this very knowledge, this capacity to interact with the divine mechanism of creation? And the servant who buried his talent in the ground, was he not like the church itself, hiding away the most valuable thing out of fear? The burden became unbearable. He was isolated by the very magnitude of the secret. He could not confess it, for no priest would have the authority to grant absolution for a sin of knowing, not doing. He was trapped between his vow of obedience to the church and his intellectual and spiritual honesty. Finally, he made a decision. He would not reveal the secret, but he would not let it die with him. He would find a way to preserve it, to pass it on to a single, worthy successor, a keeper who could guard the truth until the world was perhaps ready to hear it. It would be a secret within a secret, a flame passed from one candle to another through the long, dark night of history. His method was that of a scholar. He began a new, private work, disguised as a dense and arcane commentary on an obscure prophetic book of the Old Testament. Within its pages, written in a complex personal cipher that blended Latin, Greek, and Hebrew grammatical structures, he embedded everything he had discovered. He did not write a straightforward narrative. Instead, he created a roadmap. He recorded the exact locations of the key documents within the archive, the catalog numbers, the specific phrases to look for. He included his own interpretations, his fears, and his theological reasoning. The finished manuscript was not large, a single volume of a few hundred pages, but it was impenetrable to anyone without the key. He titled it, innocuously, A Treatise on the Cycles of Time. His next task was to find his successor. He looked for someone with a mind both brilliant and humble, faithful yet possessing the independence of spirit to question and seek. He found such a man in a young Jesuit scholar from Spain, Father Mateo Vargas. Father Vargas was known for his work on early Christian mystics, men and women who spoke in terms of union with the divine that often skirted the edges of orthodoxy. He had a reputation for quiet integrity and a deep internal faith that did not rely on external approval. Father Brennan began a careful, years-long process of mentorship. He never spoke of the secret directly. Instead, he posed philosophical questions, pointed Father Vargas towards certain historical anomalies, and encouraged him to read texts outside the standard canon. He was testing the younger priest's mind, his discretion, and his resilience. He watched as Father Vargas grappled with complex ideas, never taking the easy path, always striving for a deeper synthesis. He saw in him the necessary combination of devotion and intellectual courage. On a cold evening in the winter of 1959, with a fire crackling in the grate of his small study, Father Brennan knew the time had come. He was an old man, and his health was failing. He presented the sealed manuscript to a bewildered Father Vargas. "Mateo," he said, his voice thin but steady, "this contains my life's work, though you will find no fame in it. It is a burden, the heaviest you may ever carry. Do not open it tonight. Do not open it until you feel a profound disquiet in your soul, a sense that the story we tell is incomplete. When that day comes, the cipher is the sequence of the luminous mysteries of the Rosary, applied to the first letters of each paragraph. Guard this with your life, and when your time comes, you must find another, just as I have found you. The flame must not go out." Father Vargas, though confused and deeply concerned for his mentor, took the manuscript. He swore an oath of secrecy. 3 months later, Father Leo Brennan passed away in his sleep. The secret of the knowledge tradition, seemingly safe, passed to a new keeper. The Vatican archive held its silence. But the world was changing, and the long-buried seed of an idea, even one guarded by a single man, was beginning to stir in the dark earth of the 20th century. Father Mateo Vargas kept his oath. For a decade, the manuscript written by his mentor remained sealed in a locked chest in his quarters, a silent, weighty presence. He was a man of his word, and he did not succumb to curiosity. He lived his life, pursued his scholarly work on mysticism, and rose within the ranks of the Jesuit order. His intellect and piety recognized by his superiors. Yet, Father Brennan's final words never left him. They were a splinter in his mind, a constant, low hum of anticipation beneath the surface of his daily life. The profound disquiet that Father Brennan had spoken of arrived not as a single event, but as a gradual tide. It was the mid-1960s, and the Second Vatican Council was shaking the foundations of the Church. Windows were being thrown open, and fresh, turbulent winds were blowing through the halls of power. There was talk of aggiornamento, updating of dialogue with the modern world, of a new spirit of openness. For Father Vargas, this atmosphere of change triggered the unease his mentor had prophesied. If the Church could reconsider its relationship with the world, its liturgy, its language, was it not also the time to reconsider the deepest layers of its own history? With trembling hands, he finally unlocked the chest. He spent weeks deciphering the complex code, the key of the luminous mysteries, unfolding a narrative that was both terrifying and exhilarating. As he pieced together Father Brennan's findings, his own life's work on the mystics suddenly snapped into a new, startling focus. The experiences of St. Francis of Assisi, who spoke with creatures and felt the divine in nature. The writings of St. Hildegard of Bingen with her visions of the greening power of God flowing through all creation. The ecstasies of St. John of the Cross. These were not merely beautiful metaphors or isolated moments of grace. They were, he now saw, fragmented echoes of the very knowledge tradition that had been systematically suppressed. They were individuals who, through intense devotion and purity of heart, had accidentally tapped into the forgotten current. This realization was a thunderclap. It meant the tradition had never been fully eradicated. It had gone underground, emerging in flashes of genius and sanctity throughout history, only to be gently guided back into acceptable orthodox channels by a church that perhaps instinctively recognized its source and its danger. The mystics were tolerated, even celebrated, but their experiences were categorized as exceptional gifts of grace, not as evidence of a universal human potential waiting to be unlocked. Driven by this new understanding, Father Vargas used his growing influence to gain deeper access to the archive. He followed the roadmap Brennan had left. He found the very scrolls, the specific letters, the fragments of diaries. He confirmed it all, but he went a step further. He began to look for the counter-narrative, for the evidence of the suppression itself, and he found it. It was in the minutes of long-forgotten synods, in letters between bishops that spoke of quieting the enthusiastic ones and standardizing the message. He found a particularly chilling document from the 2nd century, a directive from a powerful bishop in Rome advising his colleagues to emphasize the coming kingdom of heaven and the authority of the apostolic line, and to let fall into disuse any teachings that focused on mastery of the earthly sphere. Father Vargas, like Brennan before him, became a man living a double life. Publicly, he was a respected theologian, contributing to the spirit of Vatican II. Privately, he was the guardian of a heresy that could dwarf all others. He began his own manuscript, adding his findings to Brennan's, tracing the ghostly lineage of the knowledge tradition through the lives of the mystics and the hidden threads of esoteric thought that had run parallel to official church doctrine for centuries. He was careful, but he was not infallible. The Vatican is an ancient organism, with its own immune system. There were always watchers. A mention in a requested document log, an unusual pattern of research inquiries, a whispered question from a librarian, small things. But they were noticed by an office so secret that its very existence was denied. An office charged with a singular duty to protect the church from threats, not from without, but from within. An office that, for lack of an official name, was known only as the custodians. Their purpose was to ensure that certain doors, once closed, remained closed forever. The first warning was subtle. A senior cardinal, a man known for his doctrinal conservatism, invited Father Vargas for a private walk in the Vatican gardens. The conversation was pleasant, circling around the challenges of modern scholarship. Then, almost as an aside, the cardinal said, "The church is like an ancient oak, Matteo. Its roots are deep in the past. To dig too recklessly around those roots, even with the best intentions, can disturb the soil that gives the tree its stability. Some roots are best left undisturbed." Father Vargas understood the message perfectly. He had been noticed. The custodians were letting him know that they were aware of his digging. It was a courtesy warning, a chance to step back. For a time, he did. He returned to his public work, his movements less frequent in the archive's restricted sections, but the secret burned within him. He knew he had to find a successor, and quickly. The flame was flickering, and the wind was rising. The world was not ready for the truth, but the keeper of the flame had to survive. The unraveling had begun, and the thread he was pulling was connected to a weave far greater and more dangerous than he could possibly imagine. The pressure from within the Vatican grew, not as a direct confrontation, but as a gentle, inexorable tightening. Father Vargas found his requests for certain archival materials increasingly delayed or denied on bureaucratic grounds. Colleagues who had once been open to his ideas now offered polite, evasive smiles. He was being isolated, frozen out. He knew his time as an active researcher within the heart of the Church was drawing to a close. The custodians were patient. Their strategy was not to crush, but to suffocate, to allow the troublesome spark to die quietly in the absence of oxygen. But Father Vargas had a final move to make. He would not find his successor within the clergy. The institution was too watchful, its patterns too ingrained. He needed an outsider, yet someone who could navigate the complex world of ancient texts and church history. He needed a scholar of impeccable reputation but independent means, someone beyond the direct influence of the Vatican. He found his candidate not in Rome, but in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Professor Samuel Thorne was a paradox. A renowned Harvard historian of late antiquity, he was also a man of deep, private faith, though he wore it lightly. He had been raised a Protestant, but had long since transcended denominational labels, focusing instead on the historical figure of Jesus and the tumultuous birth of Christianity. He was respected for his rigorous methodology and his fearless willingness to challenge established narratives. He was, in essence, the perfect vessel, an insider in the academic world, which the Vatican viewed with suspicion but could not directly control, and a man whose search for truth was his guiding principle. The invitation was extended discreetly. A conference on early Christian texts in Geneva provided the cover. Father Vargas and Professor Thorne met in a quiet corner of a hotel lounge, the clinking of glasses and the murmur of other scholars a safe buffer against eavesdroppers. Vargas, older now, his face etched with the weight of his knowledge, assessed the American. Professor Thorne. Vargas began, his English accented but precise. I have followed your work on the Q-source hypothesis. Your argument that the earliest Jesus traditions were about a wisdom teacher, a revealer of hidden knowledge, is compelling. Thorne, a man with a calm, analytical gaze, nodded cautiously. It's a theory based on textual analysis. Father, many find it uncomfortable. Truth is often uncomfortable, Vargas replied, leaning forward slightly. What if the textual analysis only reveals the tip of the iceberg? What if the earliest tradition was not just about wisdom, but about a specific, tangible knowledge, a understanding of creation so potent that it was considered too dangerous for the institutional church to preserve? The conversation that followed lasted deep into the night. Vargas did not reveal everything, but he laid out a tantalizing trail of breadcrumbs, historical anomalies, patterns of suppression, the consistent thread of an alternative tradition that emphasized a direct, experiential encounter with the divine matrix of the world. He spoke of mystics not as aberrations, but as inheritors of a fragmented legacy. He was testing Thorne, not just his intellect, but his character. Thorne was skeptical, yet fascinated. This was not the wild speculation of a conspiracy theorist. It was a carefully constructed argument from a respected, if sidelined, Vatican scholar. The pieces Vargas presented fit awkwardly, yet intriguingly, with his own research. Why are you telling me this? Thorne finally asked. Because institutions have a lifespan, Vargas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. But truth does not. The church that built its walls around this truth may one day fall. And what happens to the truth then? It must be preserved elsewhere, not to destroy the church, but to ensure that the knowledge does not vanish from the world forever. I am looking for an archivist, professor, a keeper of a library that does not yet officially exist. It was an audacious proposal. Thorne would become the first keeper from outside the Catholic Church. He would be given the accumulated manuscripts of Brennan and Vargas, a treasure map of heresy. His role would be to study, to preserve, and when the time was right, to find a new keeper, thus creating a lineage independent of Rome. After days of reflection, Samuel Thorne agreed. He was a historian, and the chance to be the guardian of what could be the most significant historical discovery of the age was irresistible. The transfer was arranged with the precision of a spy thriller. The manuscripts were not emailed or mailed. They were carried by a trusted courier, a retired Swiss guard who had served under Vargas years before, to a safe deposit box in Zurich. Thorne traveled there alone, sitting in the sterile silence of the bank vault, Thorne opened the case. Inside were not just Brennan's coded treatise and Vargas's editions, but also meticulously made photocopies of key archival documents, their Vatican catalogue numbers clearly visible. It was the evidence. As he began to read, the academic puzzle of his career dissolved into something far more profound and frightening. He was no longer just studying history. He had become a part of it. Back in Rome, Father Matteo Vargas felt a profound sense of relief, mixed with trepidation. The flame was now burning on another continent, safe from the suffocating atmosphere of the Vatican. He withdrew completely, his work seemingly done. He died peacefully 2 years later, in 1972, his secret safe. The custodians, noting his quiet retirement and the cessation of his sensitive research, closed his file. The threat, they believed, had been contained. They were wrong. The flame was now in the hands of an American academic, a man with the resources and the freedom to probe deeper than any priest trapped within the system ever could. The secret had escaped the Vatican's walls, and Samuel Thorne, sitting in his book-lined study at Harvard, began his own quiet investigation, unaware that he was being watched, not only by the distant custodians, but by other, older forces who had their own reasons for being interested in the long-buried knowledge tradition. The game had just expanded onto a global stage. Samuel Thorne's life bifurcated. Publicly, he remained a distinguished Harvard professor, delivering lectures on the socio-political dynamics of the early church, publishing carefully argued papers that stayed within the boundaries of accepted scholarship. But in the private world of his study, behind a door he now kept locked, he was an explorer charting a forgotten continent. The manuscripts from Vargas were not an endpoint. They were a starting pistol. Thorne approached the problem with the tools of a modern historian. He began cross-referencing the Vatican documents cited by Brennan and Vargas with other, external sources. He traveled to the Coptic monasteries of Egypt, studying Nag Hammadi texts not as Gnostic heresies, but as potential cousins to the knowledge tradition. He examined Islamic mysticism, certain Sufi poems echoing the same themes of divine unity and the perceptibility of God's patterns in nature. He even delved into quantum physics, finding eerie parallels in the language of interconnectedness and the observer effect. The deeper he went, the more the pattern solidified. It was as if he was listening to a single, beautiful piece of music that had been fractured into 1,000 different melodies, each culture and religion playing a fragment of the score, unaware of the whole symphony. His greatest breakthrough came from an unexpected direction: archaeology. A former student of his, now a prominent archaeologist working on a dig in southern Turkey, near the ancient city of Antioch, uncovered a small sealed lead box within the foundations of a very early Christian house church. Inside was a fragile papyrus, written in a crude form of Greek. The text was a personal letter, a prayer, or a meditation. It spoke of the light within the clay, of turning the key of the heart to unlock the world's divinity. It was dated, by contextual evidence, to the late 1st century. It was a direct, physical artifact of the very mindset Brennan had theorized about. Thorne, with his students' permission, was the first scholar to examine it. Holding that ancient papyrus, he felt a jolt of connection across 2 millennia. This was not a theory anymore. It was evidence. But Thorne, for all his academic caution, made a single, nearly fatal mistake. In his excitement, he presented a very sanitized, academic version of the find at a small, specialized conference in Berlin. He focused on its linguistic peculiarities and its significance for understanding early Christian piety, carefully omitting any mention of the knowledge tradition. He thought he was being discreet. However, he mentioned the phrase, "the light within the clay." In the audience, among the bored graduate students and tweedy professors, was a man who did not belong. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, and he took no notes. He was there for one reason. The phrase, "the light within the clay," was a trigger, a specific phrase known to the organization he worked for. It was a phrase they had been watching for, a phrase that had not been uttered in a scholarly setting for centuries. Thorne returned to Cambridge, feeling triumphant. The puzzle was coming together. A week later, the break-in occurred. It was not a crude burglary. His office at Harvard was left untouched. It was his home study that was violated. The intruder was a professional. Nothing was stolen. No drawers were left hanging open. But Thorne, a man intimately familiar with the precise order of his workspace, knew instantly. His papers had been searched. The subtle alignment of his manuscripts was off. The hidden compartment in his desk, where he kept the key to the Zurich safe deposit box, showed microscopic scratch marks around the lock. A cold fear gripped him. This was not the work of the Vatican's custodians. Their method was bureaucratic pressure, isolation, quiet suppression. This was something else. This was a direct, physical intrusion. It meant there was another player in the game, one with fewer scruples and a global reach. His suspicions were confirmed a few days later. He received a letter, posted from within the United States. There was no return address. The letter contained a single, ancient symbol drawn in black ink, a circle divided by a sinuous line, one side light, the other dark. It was the Taoist yin-yang symbol, but with a small, stylized eye drawn in the center of each hemisphere. Below it was a single, typed sentence: "Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed." Thorn had seen this symbol before. Vargas's manuscript had mentioned it in a cryptic appendix, a warning about an ancient secretive society known as the Guardians of the Dual Eye. According to Vargas's notes, this group predated Christianity. They were not a religious order but a philosophical one, dedicated to the preservation of primordial knowledge, the very knowledge that the knowledge tradition represented. They believed this knowledge was too dangerous for widespread use, that humanity cycled through ages of wisdom and ignorance, and that in ages of ignorance, like the present one, the knowledge must be protected and kept hidden until the world was ready. They saw the organized religions, including the early church, as clumsy, dangerous attempts to institutionalize a truth that could not be institutionalized. The Vatican had suppressed the knowledge tradition to build an enduring church. The Guardians of the Dual Eye wanted it suppressed to protect humanity from itself, and they were far more ancient, far more patient, and almost certainly far more ruthless than any Vatican office. Thorn realized with a sinking heart that his scholarly pursuit had inadvertently alerted to powerful, hidden forces. 1. The custodians wanted the secret buried to protect an institution. The other, the Guardians, wanted it buried to protect the world. And he, Samuel Thorn, was now the man standing in the way of both. The labyrinth had just grown darker, and he could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing from the shadows ahead. The letter with the dual eye symbol marked a before and after in Samuel Thorn's life. The intellectual adventure had vanished, replaced by a constant, low-grade hum of paranoia. He found himself noticing cars that seemed to linger too long on his street, observing faces in crowds that appeared too indifferent. The ivy-covered walls of Harvard no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a gilded cage, transparent to forces he barely understood. He knew he could not continue as he had. His research had to go even deeper underground. He rented a small, anonymous office in a nondescript building in Boston under a corporate alias, paying in cash. He moved the most sensitive documents from his home to this new location, a sparse room that became his secret nerve center. The thrill of discovery was now tempered by the grim reality of his role. He was no longer just a scholar. He was a custodian, a guardian in his own right, and the burden was immense. His focus shifted from expanding the research to securing it. He created multiple encrypted digital copies of the Brennan and Vargas manuscripts, storing them on secure servers under layers of anonymity. He began to write his own volume, not just adding his findings, but creating a kind of field guide for a future keeper. He documented everything: the methods of the custodians, the warning signs of the Guardian's interest, the safe channels of communication, the locations of physical and digital backups. The work was no longer about proving a historical theory. It was about ensuring the survival of a fragile lineage. It was during this period of intense, clandestine activity that he began to understand the true weight of the mantle he had accepted from Vargas. The knowledge tradition, if it was real, was not simply a different interpretation of Christianity. It was a paradigm shift. It suggested that the fundamental problem of human existence was not primarily moral sin, but a kind of perceptual blindness. The fall was not a disobedience, but a forgetting of how to perceive and interact with the underlying unity of creation. The miracles of the Gospels, in this light, were not violations of natural law, but restorations of it, demonstrations of what was possible when a human being operated in full alignment with this hidden reality. This understanding carried a terrifying responsibility. If this knowledge fell into the wrong hands, a corporation, a ruthless government, an individual with a lust for power, the potential for manipulation and control was unimaginable. He began to see the logic in the Guardian's secrecy. He even felt a flicker of sympathy for the early church fathers, who had chosen unity and stability over this volatile, empowering truth. The world of the 1970s, locked in a Cold War and teetering on the brink of nuclear annihilation, seemed like the worst possible time for such a revelation. The secret was not just dangerous to the Vatican, it was dangerous to the entire precarious balance of global power. This realization forced a critical decision. He could not, in good conscience, simply pass the secret on to another academic, to continue the cycle of quiet preservation. The next keeper had to be someone with a different skill set, a different kind of strength. They needed to be a pragmatist, someone who could navigate not just libraries, but the dangerous currents of the real world. The lineage needed to evolve. He found his candidate through a circuitous route. A former student of his, now a journalist, had written a series of groundbreaking articles on international intelligence agencies and their use of historical research for psychological operations. Her name was Alina Petrova. She was a Bulgarian émigré, fiercely intelligent, resourceful, and possessed of a deep, intrinsic skepticism toward all forms of institutional power. She had seen firsthand how ideologies could be weaponized. Thorne had mentored her during her undergraduate years and had been impressed by her relentless pursuit of truth and her unwavering moral compass. He reached out to her under the pretext of seeking her expertise on Cold War archival security. They met in a noisy public park in New York City, a place where private conversation was possible amidst the chaos. Thorne, older now, his face showing the strain of his double life, laid out a carefully edited version of the story. He spoke of a hidden historical truth about the early church, a truth that powerful entities, both within and outside the church, were determined to keep buried. He framed it as the ultimate investigative story, but one that could not be published, only protected. Alina listened, her journalist's mind probing for inconsistencies, her eyes searching his for any sign of delusion. But she saw only the weariness and the fierce conviction of a brilliant man who had stumbled upon something too big to handle alone. What you are describing, Samuel, is not a historical paper. It is a life sentence, she said quietly. It is, Thorne agreed. It is the responsibility of carrying a light through a very long tunnel. I cannot tell you what the light is, not yet. You would have to decide to take on the responsibility first. You would have to trust me. Alina Petrova was a woman who had built her life on questioning authority. Yet, she trusted Samuel Thorne. She had seen his integrity firsthand, and the story he hinted at resonated with her own experiences of hidden networks and suppressed truths. After a long silence, she nodded. I will listen. I will learn. The training began. It was not like the scholarly mentorship Vargas had given Thorne. Thorne taught Alina tradecraft, dead drops, surveillance detection, encryption. He taught her the history of the custodians and the little he knew about the guardians. He tested her resolve with frightening scenarios. Finally, when he was satisfied, he gave her the key. He took her to Zurich and showed her the contents of the safe deposit box. As Alina read the manuscripts, her worldview shattered and reassembled itself in a single, dizzying afternoon. She understood now why it was so dangerous. This was not a secret about the past. It was a key to a possible future. And she, Alina Petrova, the skeptic, the journalist who exposed lies, was now the chosen guardian of a truth more profound than any she had ever imagined. Samuel Thorne died 6 months later, his death attributed to a sudden stroke. It was quick and peaceful. The custodians filed him away as a resolved issue. The guardians, noting the cessation of all activity, assumed their warning had been heeded. The world moved on, but the flame had been passed again. It now burned in the heart of a woman who knew how to fight, how to hide, and how to survive. The secret was no longer in the hands of priests or professors. It was in the hands of a warrior, and the long, silent war for the soul of history was about to enter a new and far more dangerous phase. Alina Petrova was a different kind of keeper. Where Brennan had been a contemplative and Thorne a scholar, Alina was a strategist. Her battlefield was not the hushed archive, but the gritty, unpredictable world. She understood that preserving the knowledge tradition was no longer just an academic or spiritual duty. It was an intelligence operation. The secret was a volatile asset, and she was its case officer. She immediately implemented a protocol of deep cover. She publicly retired from investigative journalism, citing burnout. She moved from New York to a small, unremarkable town in the Canadian Rockies. using a carefully constructed identity as a freelance translator. Her home was a modest cabin, chosen for its isolation and its clear lines. She owned a dog, not just for companionship, but for its ears and its instinct for strangers. Elena's life became an exercise in disciplined paranoia, a necessary defense against enemies she could not always see. Her first task was to master the content of the manuscripts. For years, she pored over the writings of Brennan, Vargas, and Thorne, not as historical curiosities, but as a tactical manual. She internalized the patterns of suppression, the signatures of the custodians' bureaucratic interference, and the chilling, symbolic calling cards of the guardians. She cross-referenced every claim, using her old journalistic contacts and skills to access databases and records Thorne could never have reached. She verified the existence of the lead box from Antioch. She tracked down the descendants of the archaeological team, confirming the details of the find. She was building an unassailable case, not for publication, but for her own certainty. Her most significant contribution to the lineage was operational. She established a dead-drop system far more sophisticated than anything Thorne had imagined. It was a digital and physical hybrid. Encrypted keys were hidden in the text of innocuous online book reviews. Microfilmed capsules were sealed inside hollowed-out stones in specific locations in national parks across North America and Europe. The complete archive was scattered, a puzzle whose pieces were safe until a future keeper, guided by the instructions she was writing, could reassemble it. She ensured that the secret could not be destroyed by a single fire, a single robbery, or a single death. For nearly 2 decades, she maintained her vigil. The world changed around her. The Cold War ended. The digital age dawned, but the secret remained, constant and heavy. She never married, never put down deep roots. Her life was the mission. There were moments of profound loneliness, times when the weight of her isolated knowledge felt crushing. On winter nights, listening to the wind howl around her cabin, she would wonder if she was the last of her kind, a solitary sentinel guarding a truth the world had forgotten it ever needed. It was during this long vigil that she began to notice a subtle shift. The methods of those who sought the secret were changing. The clumsy break-in at Thorne's home had been the work of the Guardians, a classic physical intrusion. But now, she detected a new, digital fingerprint. Unexplained probes on her encrypted servers. Sophisticated phishing attempts tailored to her old journalistic interests. It was cleaner, more pervasive, and bore the hallmark of a state-level actor. The custodians, she knew, were still primarily an internal Vatican force, steeped in tradition. The Guardians were ancient, but their methods had always been more philosophical than technological. This was something else. A new player had entered the game, one with vast resources and a modern, cyber-based approach. She called this new entity the Consortium. She could only speculate on its nature: a rogue intelligence agency, a hyper-wealthy private organization, perhaps a tech conglomerate that had stumbled upon fragments of the truth and understood its potential value. The Consortium seemed to be data mining history, using algorithms to find the same patterns Brennan had found through scholarly intuition. They were getting closer. This realization forced her hand. She could not wait for a convenient time to find a successor. The threat was now. The next keeper would have to be someone who could navigate this new digital battlefield. They would need to be a native of the information age, with a skill set that complemented her own. They would need to understand code as well as catechism, networks as well as ancient networks. Her search was methodical and cautious. She looked for someone with a blend of technological prowess and philosophical depth. She found a candidate in a most unlikely place, an open-source software developer and part-time historian named Ben Carter. Ben ran a popular blog deconstructing the history of information control, from the Library of Alexandria to modern internet firewalls. He was brilliant, ethically driven, and possessed a hacker's mindset, a belief that information wanted to be free, but also an understanding of the immense responsibility that came with powerful knowledge. Elena began a slow, careful process of recruitment, mirroring Thorne's approach with her, but conducted entirely through encrypted channels. She presented herself as a like-minded researcher, probing his ideas, testing his character. She fed him crumbs of information, watching how he processed them. She saw the same spark of understanding she had felt in that Zurich vault. When she was certain, she arranged a meeting in the most anonymous place she could conceive, a bustling video game convention in Berlin. Surrounded by thousands of people absorbed in virtual worlds, she met Ben Carter. She saw the surprise in his eyes when he realized the elderly academic he was meeting was, in fact, a woman with the sharp, assessing gaze of a spy. She didn't give him the full truth, not there. She gave him a choice, just as Thorne had given her. She spoke of a legacy, a truth that could not be openly shared, a responsibility that would cost him his normal life. She saw the doubt, the fear, but also the burning curiosity she had been looking for. Ben Carter returned to his life, but nothing was the same. The invitation hung in the air, a door to a hidden world. Alina Petrova returned to her cabin in the mountains. She was older now, her own vigil nearing its end. She had done her part. She had held the line. She had adapted the lineage to survive in a new era. The secret was safe for now, but the storm was gathering. The warrior was preparing to pass the torch, and the next battle for the most dangerous secret would be fought not in archives or lonely cabins, but in the sprawling, invisible labyrinth of the digital world. Ben Carter lived in a world of code, where Alina saw physical threats and dead drops. Ben saw firewalls, encryption protocols, and data trails. His initiation was not in a quiet vault or a snowy park, but in a meticulously constructed virtual space, a secure server that existed nowhere and everywhere at once. Alina, the warrior, had become his digital sensei. She didn't just give him the manuscripts, she gave him the keys to her entire operational network. He learned the locations of the physical caches, the complex system of digital dead drops, the emergency protocols, but his primary task was to fortify. The consortium was the new enemy, and its battlefield was cyberspace. Ben built digital fortresses around the legacy. He created AI-driven sentinels to watch for the specific data mining patterns Alina had identified. He fragmented the archive further, storing pieces in the blockchain, in encrypted cloud storage with keys held by anonymous third parties, even encoded into the pixels of popular memes that circulated endlessly online. The secret became a digital ghost, impossible to pin down, existing as a whisper across the global network. For Ben, the truth of the knowledge tradition was both a shock and a revelation. It resonated with his core belief that the universe was, at its heart, a system of information. The idea that consciousness could interact with this fundamental code wasn't mystical to him. It was a hypothesis waiting for a technological interface. He began to see the work of the mystics not as magic, but as early, intuitive explorations of a user interface with reality itself. This perspective was entirely new to the lineage. Brennan the priest, Vargas the theologian, Thorne the historian, Alina the journalist, they had all approached it from a humanistic angle. Ben, the coder, saw it as a systems problem. This led him to a dangerous and groundbreaking idea. What if the tradition wasn't just a historical artifact to be preserved? What if it could be tested, not through prayer or meditation, but through technology? He began sketching designs, writing speculative code for a device that could measure the subtle energy fields the manuscripts suggested were perceptible to an awakened consciousness. He called it the resonance interface. It was a leap far beyond the role of a passive keeper. He was contemplating becoming an experimenter. Alina, monitoring his progress from afar, grew deeply concerned. She saw the brilliance in his work, but also the monumental risk. "You are trying to build a key, Ben," she wrote to him in a encrypted message. "But we are the keepers of the lock. Our duty is to protect it, not to pick it." The consortium would obliterate entire nations to possess such a device, but Ben was a child of the internet age, where knowledge was meant to be used, to be iterated upon. The prospect of simply guarding a truth felt like a betrayal of the truth itself. A quiet tension grew between the old warrior and the new technologist. The lineage was facing its greatest internal crisis. It was this tension that likely created the vulnerability. Ben, in his excitement, became slightly less meticulous. He used a secondary server, one he considered secure, to run a complex simulation related to his resonance interface. He was careful, but not careful enough. The consortium found the trace. They couldn't access the core archive, but they pinpointed his location. They didn't send men in dark suits. They launched a silent, digital siege. Ben's bank accounts were frozen. His social media accounts were hijacked and filled with bizarre posts to discredit him. A flood of sophisticated malware targeted every device on his home network. It was a warning, a demonstration of power. They were showing him that his digital fortresses were not impregnable. They were herding him. Panicked, Ben enacted the emergency protocol. He sent a coded distress signal to Alina and went completely dark, disappearing into a pre-arranged safe house with a minimal air-gapped computer system. The consortium had not captured the secret, but they had found its guardian. Elena received the signal. She was old now, her body frail, but her mind was sharp. She knew what she had to do. The chain could not be broken. Ben was compromised. His location, his methods, his digital signature were now known. He could never be a truly hidden keeper again. He had to become a decoy, a visible target to draw fire, while the true legacy was passed to someone else, someone the consortium would never suspect. She made a final, fateful decision. She would not choose another academic, another hacker, another intellectual. The pattern was predictable. The consortium would be looking for someone like that. She needed someone entirely outside the field of play. She needed a person of profound inner stability, someone whose strength was not in intellect or technology, but in character. She thought of a woman she had met years ago, a doctor who ran a free clinic in a struggling urban neighborhood, a woman named Dr. Aris Thorne. There was a reason that name resonated. She was the granddaughter of Samuel Thorne. The lineage, in a moment of poetic symmetry, would return to the family. Alina prepared her final message, a package containing the core of the secret and the instructions for Aris. She did not send it digitally. She used the oldest, most secure method she knew. She placed it in a physical dead drop, a location she had never used before, and sent a single, untraceable letter to Aris Thorne with a set of coordinates and one sentence. "Your grandfather asked me to give this to you when the time was right." Then, Alina Petrova walked out of her cabin into the Canadian winter. She was found days later, having peacefully passed away from exposure. Her death was ruled a tragic accident. The warrior's vigil was over. Ben Carter, in his hiding place, received Elena's final instruction: become the flame they chase. Let them think you have it all. Protect the true keeper by being the target. He understood. His role had changed. He was now the shield. He began to cautiously re-emerge, letting traces of his research leak, making himself a visible, tantalizing prize for the consortium. And in a small clinic in a noisy city, Dr. Aris Thorne, a woman who dealt not with ancient secrets but with immediate human suffering, received a mysterious package that would irrevocably alter her life. The most dangerous secret had found its new keeper, a healer who understood the human condition not as a historical problem, but as a present aching reality. The battle for the future of the secret was now in the hands of a woman who had dedicated her life to mending broken bodies, unaware that she was about to be tasked with mending a broken truth. Dr. Aris Thorne lived in a world of stark, immediate truths. A fever, a broken bone, the quiet despair in a patient's eyes, these were the realities that filled her days. The free clinic she ran was a fortress against suffering, and her weapons were compassion, antibiotics, and clean bandages. The mysterious package from Alina Petrova felt like an intrusion from a different universe, one of shadows and abstractions that had no place in her operating room. The package contained a letter from Alina, explaining the bare essentials of the legacy and her connection to Aris's grandfather, Samuel. It also held a small, sturdy data drive. With deep skepticism, Aris accessed it. She expected conspiracy theories, perhaps some rambling historical thesis. What she found was a narrative of such meticulous detail, supported by such a weight of cross-referenced evidence, that her scientific mind could not easily dismiss it. It was the compiled work of Brennan, Vargas, her own grandfather, and Alina Petrova. For weeks, she resisted. This was not her world. She was a healer, not a keeper of secrets. The story of the knowledge tradition, with its talk of latent human potential and a suppressed understanding of reality, seemed irrelevant to the daily struggle for survival she witnessed. How could ancient theological disputes help a child with asthma or a man dying from a preventable disease? But the legacy had a way of working on the soul. She found herself seeing echoes of it in her work. She saw how a patient's state of mind, their hope, their fear could dramatically affect their physical healing. She saw the undeniable, biological unity of her patients, how a stress in one life created ulcers, how joy could boost an immune system. Modern medicine called it psychosomatics. The manuscripts suggested this was a faint shadow of a much deeper principle, that the mind was not just a passenger in the body, but an integral part of a unified system that extended into the world itself. The breaking point came when she thought of her grandfather. She remembered Samuel Thorne not as a keeper of dangerous secrets, but as a kind, thoughtful man who had always encouraged her to question everything. She realized that his pursuit of this truth was not an academic diversion. It was the central passion of his life, a passion he had sacrificed his peace to protect. To ignore his legacy felt like a betrayal of his memory. Reluctantly, Eris Thorne accepted the burden. She became the keeper, but she would do it her way. She would not hide in a cabin or a digital labyrinth. She would integrate the protection of the secret into her life of service. The clinic became her fortress, who would look for the world's most dangerous secret in a place of such palpable, mundane need. She stored the digital archives on a server, also used for patient records, hidden in plain sight. The physical caches she began to slowly, carefully relocate to storage units near other hospitals and charitable foundations, places she had a legitimate reason to visit. Her approach to the secret itself was also unique. Where Ben Carter saw a system to be reverse-engineered, Eris Thorne saw a diagnostic tool. She began to read the descriptions of the perceptual blindness of humanity, not as a spiritual fall, but as a pathological state. What if the violence, the greed, the alienation she saw in her community were symptoms of this disconnect? The knowledge tradition, in her eyes, was not a recipe for miracles, but a potential blueprint for holistic health of spirit, mind, and body, operating in conscious harmony with a living universe. She made no attempts to contact Ben Carter. Elena's final instructions had been clear. Their paths were to remain separate. Ben was the sword, drawing the attention of the enemies. She was the scalpel, working silently and precisely to preserve the truth. She understood her role was one of pure preservation. The time for experimentation or revelation was not now. Years passed. Dr. Thorne became a respected pillar of her community, known only for her tireless work. The consortium, focused on the digital trail left by Ben Carter, found no connection to the humble doctor. The custodians, their attention turned inward on a church grappling with modern scandals, considered the matter of the knowledge tradition a dormant file. The guardians of the duel I watched and waited, as they had for millennia. Eris Thorne found a strange peace in her role. The secret did not disrupt her life. It deepened it. It gave a profound context to her healing work. Every patient she helped was a small act of defiance against the blindness, a tiny affirmation of the unity the manuscripts described. She was healing individuals, but in doing so, she was also honoring a truth about the interconnectedness of all life. She knew, however, that her vigil was temporary. The lineage had to continue. She began the quiet, patient search for a successor. She wasn't looking for a scholar or a hacker or a warrior. She was looking for someone with a different quality altogether. Immense empathy. She watched the young interns who cycled through her clinic, observing not their technical skill, but their capacity for connection, their ability to see the human being behind the illness. The next keeper would need to understand the secret, not as an intellectual puzzle, but as a truth about the human heart. The flame was now a quiet ember, glowing in the heart of a healer, waiting for the next breath of air to carry it forward into an uncertain future. The secret was safe, for now, guarded by the most powerful camouflage of all, a life of selfless service. Dr. Eris Thorne's search for a successor was a quiet, 2-decade-long meditation. She watched countless young doctors, nurses, and social workers pass through the clinic's doors. She assessed them not on their ambition or their intellect, but on a quality far more subtle and rare, a fundamental, unwavering recognition of the humanity in every person they encountered. She looked for the ones who could sit with a homeless addict and see not a failure, but a story of pain. She looked for those who could comfort a dying patient without offering false hope, their presence alone being a bomb. She was searching for an empath, a person whose consciousness was already oriented toward connection, the very antithesis of the perceptual blindness described in the manuscripts. She found her candidate in a woman named Isabella Reyes. Isabella was not a doctor. She was a music therapist who volunteered at the clinic twice a week. She had a preternatural calmness about her, a way of listening that made people feel truly heard. Eris observed her with a young girl, a trauma victim who had not spoken in months. Isabella didn't force anything. She simply sat with her, playing a gentle melody on a guitar. She mirrored the girl's breathing, her silence. It was not a technique. It was a shared space. After several sessions, the girl began to hum along. It was a small miracle, born not of medicine, but of profound, empathetic connection. Eris knew This was the quality the next keeper needed. The knowledge tradition was not about power over the world, but communion with it. Who better to guard such a truth than someone who already lived that principle in their daily life? Her approach was gentle, mirroring Isabella's own methods. She began by sharing her grandfather's historical interests. Speaking of Samuel Thorne's belief that early Christianity contained lost ideas about healing and human potential, she framed it as a philosophical curiosity, a family legacy. Isabella, with her intuitive mind, was fascinated. She saw the parallels between these ancient ideas and her own work, how music could bypass the rational mind and resonate with something deeper, how rhythm could synchronize heartbeats and breath, creating a tiny, temporary island of unity. Over years of friendship and mentorship, Eris revealed the truth in layers, like the peeling of an onion. She never presented it as a dangerous secret, but as a beautiful, fragile understanding of life that needed to be protected from the cynicism and exploitation of the world. She spoke of the custodians, the guardians, and the consortium not as shadowy villains, but as forces of imbalance, entities that, in their own ways, sought to control or suppress this fragile truth out of fear. When Eris finally showed Isabella the full archive, the moment was not one of shock or fear, but of quiet recognition. Isabella read the descriptions of the unified, conscious universe and simply nodded. "It's what the music has always told me," she said softly, "that everything is vibration, that separation is an illusion we create." Isabella Reyes accepted the role of keeper without hesitation. Her guardianship would be different from all who came before. She would not build fortresses or digital labyrinths. She would weave the secret into the fabric of her life's work. She began composing music that embedded the core principles of the tradition, themes of unity, healing, and inner light into the very structure of the harmonies and rhythms. Her compositions were beautiful and moving on the surface, but to a mind attuned to the secret, they were a silent reinforcement of its truth. She became a keeper who protected the knowledge, not by hiding it, but by encoding it into art, allowing it to resonate in the hearts of those who were ready to hear it without ever speaking a word of doctrine. Eris Thorne passed away peacefully in her sleep, her clinic a lasting monument to her healing work, her secret mission a complete success. The lineage was secure. Isabella, now the keeper, maintained her quiet life. But the world was changing faster than ever. The digital age had given way to the age of artificial intelligence, of virtual realities, and a growing cultural loneliness that even the most connected technology could not soothe. The perceptual blindness was deepening, masked by a constant stream of information and entertainment. It was in this new landscape that the hidden war entered its most critical phase. Ben Carter, the digital ghost, had spent decades as the visible target. He had led the consortium on a global chase, leaking false leads and fragmented data, keeping them occupied. But the consortium was evolving. They had begun to use advanced AI, not just to search for the secret, but to model it. They had enough fragments to understand its general outline, and their goal was no longer just to possess it, but to replicate its effects technologically. They sought to create a synthetic awakening, a tool for ultimate control. One of their AI models, scanning global cultural output for patterns aligned with their fragmentary data, flagged the music of Isabella Reyes. The analysis was clear. The mathematical structure of her compositions contained non-random, complex patterns that correlated highly with the theoretical framework of the knowledge tradition. The AI couldn't explain the why, but it flagged the what with a 99.7% probability. The consortium, for the first time, had found the true keeper, not through a mistake, but through the cold, logical analysis of a machine. A silent alert was triggered. A team was dispatched. They were not brutes. They were collectors, experts in non-invasive acquisition. Their orders were to observe and infiltrate, to gain access to Isabella's personal records and compositions to confirm the finding. Isabella, whose sensitivity was tuned to human emotion, felt the shift immediately. It was a subtle dissonance, a feeling of being watched by something that did not feel. She didn't understand the source, but she trusted her intuition. She enacted the emergency protocol Eris had taught her, sending a coded message of distress through a seemingly innocent update to a music streaming service. The message was received by the only person it could be, Ben Carter. After a lifetime of being the decoy, he received the signal that the true keeper was in danger. The shield now had to become the sword. The digital ghost had to materialize. The final act of the centuries-long drama was beginning. The empath's gaze had met the unblinking eye of the machine, and the keepers of the world's most dangerous secret were finally, truly exposed.